I'll open this meeting of the City of Kerrville Planning and Zoning Commission. Dorothy, would you take roll, please?
Yes, sir. Bob Waller.
Present.
Derek Harmon.
Here.
Fisher Byram.
Here.
David Jones.
Here.
Justin Zuber.
Here.
Jim Brown. Bill Morgan.
Here.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you. We have a quorum. Number one on the agenda is a consent agenda. Only one item, 1A, that's the approval of the minutes from the June 6th, 2019 meeting. That starts on page 3. If there are any comments or amendments that need to be made, let us know. Otherwise, I'll accept a motion.
Make a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
I have a motion. To have a second?
I'll second.
A motion and a second. All in favor, raise your right hand. Passes 5-0. Thank you. Item number 2 is public hearing, consideration and action. True.
Thank you, Chairman. This is consideration and action of public hearing to approve an ordinance adopting the City of Kerrville, Texas zoning code, a comprehensive rewrite of the city's zoning regulations in accordance with the Kerrville Comprehensive Plan, Kerrville 2050, to be known as the City of Kerrville, Texas zoning code, Chapter 60 of the Code of Ordinances, adopting the official zoning map of the city, providing for maintenance thereof, and providing procedures to amend said map, repealing in their entirety all ordinances or parts of ordinances inconsistent within. And with that, I'd like to introduce our consultants, Mark Bowers and Monica Hyde.
Welcome, Mark.
Thank you. Chairman Waller and members of the Kerrville Planning and Zoning Commission. Again, my name is Mark Bowers. I'm a planner with the firm Kimley Horn. And making a portion of the presentation with me this evening will be Monica Hyde with Prologue Planning. So we're going to give you an overview of the process and findings of the ordinance. And then Monica will be walking through the draft zoning code with overall highlights, and especially highlights with changes since the last time we presented that to you at the joint session. We'll have a preview or a little more information related to the draft zoning map, and then be open to any questions you have of us along with the public hearing. So as a part of this, the overview of the process and findings, the process to date, we started with diagnostic meetings of your existing code. We understood that there were some basic elements of the code that are important to maintain in the community. The basic regulation that's there, the level of regulation. So we used that as a starting point. Did some diagnostic meetings with city staff to identify some of the issues that they might be dealing with that they wanted to have addressed. We had periodic project coordination calls since October of last year. We had 3 days of stakeholder interviews with architects, builders, engineers, property owners, developers, just to hear what their experiences were with the codes and the types of things that they'd like to see change that they thought would make it a little bit more user-friendly. 6 meetings with the CRC, the Code Review Committee, November 2018 through early June, earlier this month. A joint P&Z and City Council work session on March 19th, and then a community open house on May 16th where the community as a whole could weigh in on the draft ordinance. So some of the things that we learned from the stakeholder interviews, we took information from them first off to hear what were some of the things we needed to address to start to establish some project goals. We heard the code is cumbersome, difficult to navigate, unclear, and requires too much interpretation. And the issue with interpretation by staff is that those interpretations could lead to inconsistencies and a lack of confidence in the process on part of the development community. Another item in the new code, they asked us that we be reasonable, logical, and not add a lot of new requirements. It was really more about cleaning up your existing code and bringing it up to date based on enabling legislation from the state. We heard there were too many zoning districts in the code, and the districts are too similar. Too many uses required a CUP, and that process was difficult and also added to the length of the code as well as the complexity of the code. So through that process, building on that and some of the things that we heard, from staff and their experience with the code, we had established some draft project goals, and we worked with the CRC on furthering these goals and developing these goals in a little bit more detail. Those overall goals were to create a user-friendly ordinance moving forward that would be simplified, streamlined, and clarify your existing code, revise out-of-date standards and uses, address inconsistencies, and minimize that need of interpretation by staff. A separate goal was to minimize nonconformities resulting from the new code and zoning map. We've done quite a bit of analysis related to the nonconformities, but that was one of the key goals. That was our marching order to make sure that as we move forward, we weren't creating a lot of new inconformities within your community. And support the Kerrville 2050 vision. In other words, the comprehensive plan, there were some uses that weren't anticipated in your existing code, so we wanted to incorporate some things into the new code that would better enable that vision to become a reality going forward. So as we look through some of the specific issues and implications, we heard that the zoning should support the Kerrville 2050 Comprehensive Plan. So our recommendation, and all of these recommendations were then supported by the CRC as we move forward, was to develop new districts and revise regulations as necessary to accommodate Kerrville 2050. And really the specific areas were on those special opportunity sites that were identified in Kerrville 2050. That's where really the key changes took place to support that future vision. The next one, too many zoning districts, and most of the district names, including those with geographic references, do not indicate the types of uses allowed. Your zoning map and zoning code is one of the first things that folks in the development community look at if they're considering developing in your community. And they want to see right off the bat where they might be able to develop the type of development or property that they're envisioning. And we saw that as a real barrier towards potential investment in your community, and that it was a little bit difficult. You really had to dig into it to figure out where you might be able to develop certain products. So we suggested consolidating similar districts, eliminate those that were not currently being used, and rename districts to reflect the character, for instance, retail, commercial, or industrial manufacturing, so that it's pretty clear the type of thing you want to do, which of those districts it might fall into right off the bat. Color coding not consistent with planning standards. That's another aspect where professionals look at your map and say, okay, I do manufacturing or I do office. There's a color coding you would expect to see to support those. It was not part of your previous zoning map. So we really revised those colors, which was a recommendation that the committee supported. Incomplete list of uses. Some uses were more like categories, and too many uses required a CUP. So we've recommended and we've significantly expanded and updated the list of uses to minimize interpretation by staff, provided many new definitions for uses, and reduced the number of CUPs significantly throughout the process. Next issue, specific use districts and activities are not consistent with Kerrville needs and desires. So there were several things that were uses listed that weren't necessarily occurring in your community, and some of those were heavy industrial, sometimes noxious uses that communities may not want to just say we're open to that by having it in your ordinance. So many of those uses we're just now silent on. If somebody wants to propose those types of things, they still have the opportunity to make that proposal, and you can evaluate them through a process with PDs or other processes to be able to locate them if they're appropriate in your community. But we did end up eliminating that section of the code. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Monica, and she's going to go through in a bit of detail the overall code. She's going to go quickly through the items that you saw previously at the joint session, and then focus in a little bit more on the things that changed based upon the feedback that we got from you, and also additional feedback at the community open house. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission. I'm going to try to do my best to sort of walk that fine line between too much information and not enough, because I know many of you have seen the majority of this presentation before, but I also know that there are people here who have not, so I feel like there's some basic stuff that I can't afford to leave out. So let's start with just the overall approach that we decided upon when we initially began this project, and this is in consultation with the staff and after stakeholder interviews, etc. We wanted to preserve the existing code where that made sense, add some standard verbiage, mostly in the administrative sections, things that you find in most normal zoning codes, reorganize the document if necessary in order to improve the flow, expand the list of permitted uses and the definitions that would go with them, again, to minimize the need for staff to make interpretations, to develop a revised format for the district regulations to help people be able to make like only 1 or 2 stops within the code in order to find the information they needed. Within the district regulations themselves, to base height and setback not on the type of use but on the zoning category. Look for options to help with your affordable housing challenge, and also to create any new districts that might be necessary to keep the Kerrville 2050 plan moving forward. So what I'm going to do is just sort of walk through these article by article and try to keep it short and sweet but get the information out there that's necessary. The first 3 or 4 articles are administrative provisions, and they list the title of the ordinance and the authority of the city to do this type of regulation, the purpose of a zoning ordinance, and then there is a definition section that includes not only just some basic terms but also concepts and every item that you see listed in the land use table. And there are a lot of new items, so there are a lot of new definitions. Articles 11I, 6, and 7 are standards and regulations regarding the P&Z, the Planning and Zoning Commission, this body, and the Zoning Board of Adjustment. They basically standardize the content or the outline of the content between the 2 different boards. And that means that there were some items that were covered in for one board and not the other, but there's no need to leave those gaps, so we filled those in. I'll point out to you a couple of changes. Membership, appointment, and terms, for example. We're proposing that P&Z alternates become regular members, so that there would now be 7 full members, and a quorum for this body would be 4. The ZBA, though, would continue with 5 members and 2 alternates, so still 7, but 5 members and 2 alternates. But different would be that all members and alternates would participate in discussion, and alternates would vote then only if needed in the case of an absent member. I'm sorry. So alternates would vote only if there was a member absent. And no change in the fact that 75% of the members would have to be present to hear a case. That's already in state law. We outline the duties and powers of each board, and then there's some information on open meetings, organization, records, etc. The next article addresses the process for requesting a variance to the zoning code and the method for appealing a city official's interpretation of a provision in the zoning ordinance, and those are pretty consistent with the code as it currently sits. There wasn't really a need for much change there. Then we get into the meaty stuff, which is the zoning districts. One of the things we did was address the issue of zoning newly annexed territory. An applicant that if an applicant is requesting annexation, sorry. Oh, I thought I did. Sorry, I pushed something else. If an applicant brings in a request for annexation and has a zoning proposal that they would like to make at the same time, then the P&Z could consider that, kind of concurrently. If they did not, and annexation was still desirable, then the property would assume an agricultural zoning until permanent zoning could be established. The ag district did not exist before, so that's a new district. Zoning district boundaries. It's mostly an issue that's fairly clear when you actually look at a map. There will be some sort of physical feature that will help to define a zoning district boundary line or some ownership line. But if it's unclear, interpretations would be made by the Director of Development Services, and subject to appeal if a property owner was in objection. And that's pretty consistent with the current code as it stands right now, too. Then we move to one of our, at this? Okay. Then we moved to one of our biggest goals, and that was reducing the number of zoning districts that the code currently includes. And right now there are 49, and I think everybody agreed that that was too many. And like Mark mentioned in the earlier remarks, the geographical districts don't really help an applicant determine what can happen on pieces of property. So we wanted to eliminate those and just reduce the number. So now we are down to 17 zoning districts, 7 of them residential, 4 of them non-residential, and 6 of them special districts, and that includes PD. So that's a 65% reduction, which I think is pretty substantial. We talked about the color coding system that's currently in place not being recognizable to people in the development industry and planners and architects in general. So we have developed a color coding system that does make sense now out in the world where this information is going to be most necessary. Our district regulation strategy is summarized as follows. In the residential areas, we generally maintained existing area regulations and height regulations, or relaxed them a little bit, because one of our charges, as you'll recall earlier, was to try to not create additional or new nonconformities. One of the things we did, though, to address one of the other goals, was to add some smaller lot alternatives in the R2 and RM districts. In the non-residential categories, we did a very similar thing. We tried to maintain regulations as much as possible where they made sense, or even relaxed them a little bit to try to avoid creating nonconformities. But we are proposing that in order to protect your single-family neighborhoods where you have a non-residential, residential adjacency, that there be some height limitations, just so that, and I'll show you some slides in a second, so that there's a stepping back of building height adjacent to single-family districts. We did eliminate in the non-residential districts a requirement for a side or rear yard setback unless it's adjacent to single-family. So a couple of things we did with neighborhood preservation specifically in mind. On the special districts, because each of them has its own purpose, our strategy varied by district. So more specifically, in the residential districts, we now have a residential estate district, which has a 1 acre minimum lot requirement. That's something that we did because it was a desire that was called out in the Kerrville 2050 Comprehensive Plan. For the most part, the other regulations match the R1 district. In the R1 district, we did reduce the minimum lot size from 6,000 to 5,000 square feet, and that was as a result of desires on the part of the CRC, the Code Review Committee. The R1A district is maintained, and that's where you can have a single-family lot with an apartment or an accessory dwelling unit on it. The revision we made there was to allow that accessory, no, I'll do it. I'm so focused on moving forward. In the R1A district, we wanted to maintain the ability to put an accessory dwelling unit on a lot with a single family property, and there's not too much of that zoning district on the ground, but we're allowing that accessory unit to be not only in the main dwelling, but also possibly in a detached structure. So that's a new option. We replaced the RC, Residential Cluster District, with an R2 district. But we do maintain the basic concept of having one single zoning category that allows a multitude of different housing types. So they're a single family, but we did create a couple of new options for smaller lots, a 3,300 square foot lot and a 4,500 square foot lot. You'll still have the option of doing patio homes, townhomes, duplexes, but now we have a more complete set of regulations to go with those options. The R3 district will be exclusively a multifamily district if the code's adopted. The RM district allows the R2 uses plus manufactured housing. And the RT, Residential Transition District, which again you have on the books already, allows non-residential and residential uses in the same neighborhood. It does have a limitation on building size for buildings containing non-residential uses, with a few exemptions for public type facilities. So that's sort of a summary of what we did with the residential districts. with the non-residential districts, and all of these are new because most of these were West 1 and East 27, you know, they were the numbered and geographically referenced districts. So these are all new names, and they're all consolidated. So the C1 district is the most restrictive neighborhood commercial district, and it's based upon generally your limited retail and limited personal service activities or zoning categories that you currently have in the code. It does propose a limit on the size of individual buildings there, but that limit was increased from 3,000 square feet to 5,000 square feet, and there is a limit on the total building area on a single lot to 10,000 square feet. We are adding drive-through windows as a CUP use, because very often you'll find the C1 district near, fairly near residential. So that's why a little more precautions are taken in that particular zoning category. C2 is the next up district in the commercial arena. So it allows all the C1 uses, plus it gets into some of the light auto-related activities like parts sales and minor repair and car wash. Drive-through service there is allowed by right, and you have much more leeway in terms of the amount of total building square footage that can be on a single property. So you're going to have probably larger lots that are zoned C2. And then once you take it out one more step, that's C3, which is general commercial, and that allows C1 and C2 uses, plus heavier activities like auto-related uses like dealerships and major repair, building contractor uses. It allows some activities like car title loans and check cashing, hotels, motels, movie theaters, parking lots and structures, uses involving outdoor storage, a higher degree of outdoor storage. And there is no limit on the total square footage that can be on a single lot. And then we move into IM industrial and manufacturing, where you'll have all the traditional industrial type uses, manufacturing, assembly, warehousing, as well as agricultural services, some heavier commercial uses, like the ones that were allowed in C3, as well as others that involve a higher level of outdoor storage. And we did toss in there a specific set of business and employee support services for people that might be working in the area and that might need to make runs on the way home or at lunch hour or whatever. So, and I would say overall, the setbacks and maximum building size requirements were relaxed to allow some flexibility again and to minimize nonconformities. And we did add the setback and height limitations to protect single-family districts adjacent to these non-residential properties. But it was sort of a trade-off situation, and there were not really great protections for single-family that might be abutting upon non-residential, and we thought that was important. The special districts there are 6, and each has its own intent. The downtown Arts and Culture District is the first that I'll talk about, and you can sort of see the area on the map where that zoning applies, and it's largely replacing your downtown core and your CBD. And so we have that particular zoning category, and one of the things it does is emphasize walkability and support for an arts and culture district, and that kind of support is provided by the ability to mix uses within the district, residential and non-residential, as well as within single buildings. So all of those should help keep a better and more sustainable arts and culture district in downtown for you. There's a lot of emphasis put on the building as it relates to the street. So pedestrians do tend to like to have, a building kind of snuggled up next to the sidewalk and all that. It's just a totally different environment that we're trying to create, much of which is already in place in a lot of your blocks here in this downtown area. The mixed-use district incorporates some of those same kinds of concepts, the mixing of residential and non-residential uses and flexible parking requirements, because hopefully you would be able to accomplish more than one thing, on a single trip. So that's the concept behind that. This was a district that we created in support of some of the strategic catalyst area concepts in the Kerrville 2050 plan. One thing that is is unique is that we're proposing that there be a requirement for open space in a mixed-use district that would be equivalent to 8% of the building footprint. So like the foundation, the 8% of that area would be provided on-site if there were multifamily units on a piece of property, and that's just to provide some open space for people, you know, kids, whether they live there or visit there on the weekends or whatever. So that open space would be maintained by the property owner and would be located so that it was safe and not secluded or anything like that, and fenced and lit properly. Next is the planned development district, and this one you have already, but we wanted to make it clear in the purpose statement of the district that the goal of a PD is not to circumvent existing zoning requirements, but to help someone create a better development. There is a requirement for at least 5 acres in order to make a PD application. In exchange for more flexible requirements, because the applicant basically gets to fill in the blanks on a PD, they tell you what the height's going to be, they tell you what the setback will be, they'll tell you what the uses are. But in exchange for that flexibility, they have to provide you more information up front as part of the application. They have to provide you a concept plan, for example, that addresses all those issues that I just mentioned. We also have a provision in here so that if there were a situation, as is often the case in these developments because they are very complicated, if there was a case where an applicant or a developer wanted to make a minor amendment to the concept plan that was approved as part of the PD zoning, they could do that, and the criteria are listed there. Limits on the number of units or building square footages that might increase, no decrease in setback or parking, those sorts of things. Those approvals could be done at the staff level, so they wouldn't have to come clear back through a process and hold everybody up. If they did not fit those criteria, however, they would need to come back to P&Z and council for review, just like the original application. Public and institutional is a district that would accommodate public facilities and gathering places. You can imagine what those would be: churches, schools, those kinds of things, your arts facilities, museums, etc. Residential would no longer be a permitted use except for like a rectory or parsonage or a dormitory at a university. Doesn't really make sense to have somebody be able to do a single-family dwelling in a district like that. Then the requirements there are generally flexible. There is a height limitation, but an increase allowed once you get a certain distance from residential. There is a screening requirement adjacent to residential, and no outdoor storage would be permitted because those kinds of things can get carried away, as you probably are aware in some settings. We have also the airport district, and on the airport property itself, we went in and reduced the setback some, kind of based upon what we're seeing down there already, and we don't have any specific parking requirement, but there's also property that's zoned airport district that's not part of the airport proper, and so there we are allowing uses that are compatible with an airport. The setbacks are essentially the same as for industrial. Some height limitations, also taking into account the FAA requirements, and then again, limitations on height and setback and screening adjacent to residential. And the final district is the ag district that I mentioned some time ago, and that's a new one. And so it would accommodate not only agricultural uses, but it would be a holding category for newly annexed property, like I talked about earlier. That would be a minimum 5-acre requirement, and in general, the area and height regulations are like the R1, your basic residential district. So the district regulations format, if you go into the code itself and you go to the R1 district, for example, you're going to see a few things that are in common with every other district, and then you're going to get into a table of requirements that are specific for that zoning category. Every district that we created is going to have a purpose statement, a very general description of the uses with a reference to the more detailed land use table, and then you get into that area and height regulations table. The exception being PD, because as I mentioned earlier, that's kind of a fill-in-the-blank sort of an approach to zoning. Now, depending upon what zoning district you're in, there may be some other things like certain areas, there are access limitations, provisions for encroachments into required setbacks, screening requirements, that sort of thing. So there's some other things that you'll find that vary by district, but those first two or three are standard throughout. So let's go ahead and just look at one portion of one of the tables. This is the R1 district, and you can see the top line that has requirements in it has a minimum lot size and a minimum lot width, a front setback, side setbacks for interior, which means not corner, and corner lots, rear setbacks, a maximum building height, and minimum parking. Now, in the residential districts, we are able to put the minimum parking requirements into the table. In the other districts, because in those commercial districts, you can have such a variety of uses, you have to go back to a parking table, but that's not too cumbersome. All right, so that's kind of how it works. And for a couple of housing types, there are some special requirements, like in the accessory dwelling unit in the R1A district that we mentioned a while ago, where you could actually have a separate structure, if that was your desire. You can do that, but there's a maximum percentage of rear yard area that can be occupied. So that's a special requirement that only applies in a situation like that. So there's a couple of instances like that. Now, I mentioned to you the setback and height system that we're proposing adjacent to residential, and that's where non-residential and most special district properties would be adjacent to single-family zoning. And those single-family zoning categories would be the RE, the residential estate, R1, 1A, and 2, RM, and then if you had a mixed use or PD zoning category that had those types of uses in it, then it would apply next to those districts as well. All right, and here's how it works. And you have the graphics there. Yeah, I'm pointing to, I don't know if you'll be able to see the slide, the light or not. I think I can do it without having to point it. So there's a 25-foot setback now that's going to be required between a building wall and a residential property line. Now, when I say residential, again, it's those zoning districts I mentioned just a moment ago. So that's a setback. That's just open area. Now, it can be used for parking. It can be used as driveway. It can be used as landscaping. It doesn't mean it has to just be sitting there and, no good to the property owner. It just can't have a building sitting on it. All right? And once you get at that 25-foot setback point, your building can be up to 35 feet in height, and it can have windows at the ground floor level. There was a concern on the part of the CRC with windows on a second floor level, potentially overlooking someone's backyard. So you can have them at the ground level. You cannot have them at the second floor level if your building is sitting at 25 feet. If you are willing to move your building back to 50 feet, or even any portion of a building that's sitting back at 50 feet. So if, for example, you have some building that's sitting at 25 feet, and then you increase and you set up another portion of the building back at 50, you can have windows at that second floor level because they shouldn't be as likely to be able to see into the single family. Okay? So you can have there's no restriction on windows is the easiest way to say it, once you get past 50 feet. But you still have the 35-foot height limit. Then, next slide, if you move back to 100 feet, then your building height automatically jumps up to 45, and windows are permitted at the 45-foot point at any level. Once you get beyond 100 feet, so starting right at 101, you can start increasing your height at a rate of 1 foot taller for every 1 foot the building is set back from that 100-foot point. All right. So you have a sort of a stair step. If this showed all levels of the building that could possibly be, you'd have a 35-foot at 25 feet. You'd have a 35-foot high building, but windows only at the ground floor. Then at 50 feet, you could put windows at that second story level. Then at 100 feet, you can jump your building up to 45 and take off and increase the height like on a plane at a rate of 1 to 1. Okay? And in all those instances, any area that's open between the building in the single-family residential would have a use available to it for parking, circulation, whatever. All right?
Got a quick question on
Mhm.
that. What about canopies, porch coverings, shade arbors? At what point do those things start becoming part of the building?
Well, I would have to understand how your ordinance works, but typically anything that's permanently attached to the structure would probably be considered part of the structure.
Okay. Even if it's non-conditioned space? Okay.
Okay, so screening, still screening options of masonry or solid weather resistant wood, but the staff thought it would be a good idea to give the option of including landscape sections in a row of screening of that sort, so we've got that in the proposal. Also chain link or ornamental fencing, which would include decorative metal or the vinyl panels with landscaping. Landscaping would be required if you were to use one of those two. We did rule out, or are suggesting that you rule out chain link with slats, except for in the PI, public and institutional zoning districts. Rule it out there? Okay. Okay, I think I need to make that fix. Okay. Whatever screening method is utilized, if it is required, it needs to be 6 to 8 feet in height. And if there is a physical, if there's a terrain or some vegetation or something that provides screening so that it doesn't seem necessary to do a man-made sort of a barrier, then an applicant can come to P&Z and ask for some relief from the screening requirement. Outdoor storage, and that would apply to materials, supplies, inventory, equipment. It's going to be allowed in C2, C3, IM, and AD, but if it's adjacent to single family, it would require screening. All right. Then we get into the land use table. We're ending up with about 200 uses as compared to the 47 that you have now. But the 47 that you have now, A, didn't address some uses that were sort of obvious omissions. The example I always use, I think, is bank. It's not in there anywhere now, and it obviously should be. Probably was interpreted as an office, but that's fine. Now it's called out. The other is that some of the current uses are really categories. So it'll say retail limited, but then you have to go back to the definition for retail limited to find the actual list. Here we have them all enumerated. So the way the table works is you see that there's a land use is on the left-hand side, and then permitted uses are indicated with a P. CUP uses are indicated with a C. Blank means it's not permitted. Occasionally there are uses that have little notations with them because they have some little special features that go along with them, and then you have a notes column that explains what the notes mean. So that's how it works. It's a much longer table, but I think it's going to be more useful. That was the idea. Supplementary requirements for certain uses. There are some types of uses that are listed here, and that's what some of those notes would be referring to, that also may have some special features associated with them, like any activity that has to do with motor vehicle fuel probably needs to be kept away from your water source, some distance away from your water source. So we have a new requirement there for that. We have some new standards for uses that involve stacking, drive-through banks, drive-through restaurants, those kinds of things. So we have new standards both in writing, and we do have a couple of graphics to go along with those as well. And then your current code already has some special kinds of requirements for uses like daycare facilities and community gardens. Those are still there. We moved home occupations back into this section. All those standards were in the definition section, which is not where they belong, so now they're here. Someone can find them there. CUPs, one of our big desires was to reduce the number of uses that require a CUP. Well, let me talk about the process first. There is a in your ordinance now, there is a list of requirements that has to be part of an application for a zoning change and a CUP, okay? And they're two different lists, and they're way too detailed than they need to be at the stage of the game where you're just asking for permission to rezone a piece of property. Now, there are certain things that you have to have, obviously. You need an application, you need a fee, you need a general description of the use, and you fill all the rest of it in by using a checklist, okay? So our suggestion is that you shorten that list of requirements and then refer to a checklist for all the detail. Because otherwise, if you make any change to what you want somebody to give you for an application, you have to go through this whole process of revising your zoning ordinance again. So to give you some flexibility, but still maintain the ability to get what you really need and put some teeth behind the checklist, this is what we think will work best, and it's very frequently done this way. Now, some zoning categories like PD, mixed use, they require a little bit more detail, but that's appropriate because there's not a zoning category that necessarily fits the bill for them. Let me see, did I cover everything there? Yeah, I think so. All right. One of the things we're suggesting is that there might be a thing or two that you could do with your public hearing process to speed things along and not giving up any sort of public access. But for example, if for a zoning change or a CUP request, you don't get through the public hearing at the first meeting, rather than having to re-notify at the point in the meeting where you say we're recessing this public hearing, if you recess it to a specific date, then it's on the public record. Everybody can find out when it's coming back up, and you don't have to do all the notification, which can potentially lengthen the time. The time is less, probably, maybe not the most important thing, but it's the expense and it's the effort and all of that sort of thing. So that could save you a little bit of headache. Also, we're suggesting that if the P&Z recommends denial, that an application only go to council if the applicant requests that it move forward in writing within 10 days of the P&Z's decision. Okay? And otherwise, the council doesn't have to deal with it if the applicant says, well, okay, I heard it, and there's no need in going forward. The last thing here is, and this is really not an issue of expediting anything, but right now, your ordinance doesn't say for a CUP that if there's a 20% protest, then there's a 3/4 vote of the council, and it needs to, because it's just like any other zoning change. All right? Now, for both CUPs and zoning changes, the biggest change is probably, as I said, in regards to the amount of information that has to come in the beginning, because the review procedures are pretty much spelled out by state law. You don't have a whole lot to say about those. We are reducing the number of CUPs by making a lot of uses permitted by right in appropriate zoning districts. And so there's a noticeable difference there. And there was also a list of uses that were allowed without a CUP. Okay, we just put those into the table too. So we're trying to, sort of streamline the ordinance with regard to those sorts of things, in addition to simplifying the submittal requirements. This particular slide shows the previous table, land use table, or I say previous, it's actually the current land use table. It's a complete table, and you can see there's a lot of CUPs. That's what's highlighted there in yellow. The next slide is an excerpt from the proposed code, and granted, this is, the whole table is a lot longer, but you can see that there are far fewer CUPs, and this is all I did was pull the first 30, I think, uses, and so there's far fewer uses that are going to require CUP review. Mark mentioned earlier the special use district that we are suggesting that you simply eliminate, because I think the majority of those uses in there you don't want in your community anyway, and also because if somebody brings you one, then you just treat it like a CUP request. Okay, moving on to parking. Our plan was to update the requirements based on current practices and uses that were not previously addressed, so we tried to fill in those gaps. For new uses, we added a parking requirement And then certain types of uses have unique parking characteristics. I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute. We did have a discussion about bicycle parking, and the feeling was that that was probably an issue that would be most applicable in downtown in the river corridor. So when the overlays come before this body, the overlay guidelines come before this body, bicycle parking will be addressed in those two corridors. Now, just very quickly on this parking standards, I chose just a few uses that have what I'm calling are some unique parking characteristics. As you can see, auto service and repair facilities, they have parking bays. That's really what generates the need for parking in a situation like that, not the square footage of the building. In a bank, it's the square footage of the building. That's really more what calls out for parking. Car washes, full service car wash is very different than a self-service car wash, so we're proposing different parking ratios. In a church, whereas you might normally park a large enclosed area based upon square footage, church is a whole different deal. So the parking there is based on number of seats in the facility, that's what your ordinance currently does. So just let me show you just a couple of things I want to point out about the ratios themselves. You can see there on this particular slide, banks, offices, general offices, and veterinary services now are all parking at the same ratio, 1 per 300 square feet. Medical office, we're still parking a little more stringently because we've all been to the doctor's office, right? You know how hard it is to find a parking spot. So we're parking those at 1 per 200, all right? But those were all parked differently under the previous code. For retail, we are suggesting a parking ratio of 1 space for every 300 square feet. For retail stores and centers up to 100,000 square feet in size, and excluding areas like storage and bathrooms in the office and that sort of thing, as opposed to, you see there's a split ratio, 250 square feet under your current code and 750 for those more non-public areas. Large items like furniture stores and appliance stores and that sort of things, we're proposing 1 per 400. Multifamily, right now you park at 2 spaces per unit, and the suggestion here is that we move to a parking ratio based upon number of bedrooms. And that we also add a requirement for separate parking for boats and trailers, because if you're not careful, they'll end up taking up multiple spaces that are really needed for people who reside in an apartment building. Okay.
1.5 cars?
Well, that just means that if you have 2 units, it's 3 cars, 3 spaces. And you always round up. So if you were for some reason only to have 1 apartment unit, it would still need 2 spaces because it would round up. But if you have 75, then you park as if you have, 76, I guess.
Okay.
And we looked at multiple communities. We looked at about 5 or 6 communities, and that's not an uncommon approach. So in the end, I think it'll work out just fine. Nonconformities, and I do feel like we need to walk through this just a little bit more slowly, because this is the kind of thing that can really concern people. First of all, let's just agree that about what a nonconformity is. That would be a situation where a lot, structure, use, or site element, other than a sign, not a sign, existed or operated legally until a new code was adopted. All right, so that would be a situation that became non-conforming as a result of adopting a new code. Now, a situation like that, a use can continue to exist or operate, so it's grandfathered in, as long as it's not expanded or enlarged. All right, so that means the area within a building devoted to a use like that, the size of the building itself. There could be no expansion into another building or construction of a new building. Number of residential units couldn't increase. The number of non-conforming uses or units of a use could not increase. So in other words, you couldn't add more. You couldn't take 1 apartment and carve it into 2. That would be an increase in the number of units. That would not be permitted, even though 1 apartment unit would be non-conforming. 2 apartment units would be more non-conforming, so you sure can't do that. seating capacity or storage or parking area or something like that. So those are things that could not be done and would be considered expanding or enlarging. Now, your current code does allow, and this is not uncommon in codes in general, that a non-conforming use can change to another non-conforming use of the same category, but once it becomes less non-conforming or totally conforming, it can't go back to that old non-conforming use. So if you're in a district, let's say you're in a C1 district now, it's a property that's not rezoned to C1, and it's got a C3 use going on in it, all right? Well, they could do another C3 use, or they could do a C2 use. If they do a C2 use, they can't go back to the C3 use, okay? If 1 is the most restrictive, 2 is medium, and 3 is least restrictive, okay? So the idea is to progress towards conforming and never to go backwards, okay? Also, if a use is abandoned for 6 months or more, then it's no longer legally non-conforming. Now, the criteria for that, for abandonment, are typically if the use is actually discontinued, if there's no record of usage of water, electricity, sewer, that sort of thing, and if nobody is actively marketing the property. So if it sits out there for 5 years, 10 years, whatever, 2 years, and thereby becomes non-conforming, doesn't suddenly get its conforming status back just because somebody wants to move in.
Does this include grandfathered properties that are there now? We have a number in town that are real eyesores that have been abandoned as long as I can remember.
Mm-hmm.
Will this now apply to them?
Well,
They'll have to take them down?
It depends on what's been happening in the interim. If somebody has been if there's been a sign out there trying to market the property, or somebody has had an ad in some sort of publication trying to market the property, if there has been electricity usage there, it sounds like they probably actually abandoned, that criteria may be met, but it has to really meet all the criteria. It's a difficult process.
It has to have been for sale before you can say it's abandoned?
No.
Okay.
No.
And I know of one that's it's been vacant 23 years, falling down upon itself.
Well, all that means is it can't be reoccupied.
But you can't make it take it down.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's hard to make this fit every situation that, is perhaps unsightly. But there are times when it can help. Okay. A non-conforming use or structure could be reinstated or rebuilt if it is discontinued or destroyed by fire, flood, any of those natural disasters. Even if it's 100% destroyed, that was the wish of I think we discussed at the joint meeting and also the CRC. So that's what everybody agreed to. Originally, we had talked about 50%, but the final decision was even if it's 100% gone. But it has to be, the reconstruction would have to be rebuilt or initiated within 6 months. So in other words, it can't sit there for 23 years if it gets torn down. And it can't be built to be more non-conforming than the previous structure. All right?
Question, if they're gonna rebuild, as long as they do not exceed the present square foot, they could change the footprint, right?
As long as they don't change it so that it is less consistent with the new code requirement.
But if in the same lot, they could build it different dimensions, and don't have to use the same.
It's possible that there could still be a footprint that was yeah. It's not guaranteed, but it's possible. Somebody should be able to come up with a plan.
Just asking.
And still maintain the same square footage. Okay. Then it's still okay to repair or maintain a building or site. But a building permit may be required. That just because it's non-conforming doesn't mean you don't have to have a building permit for certain things. There is a section in state law that talks about property becoming non-conforming as a result of annexation, and that is basically it's basically said it's grandfathered in until they do something different, so it's, well, we chose to just reference that passage of state law. And if someone wants to appeal these non-conforming provisions, to allow reinstatement of a non-conforming use or expansion of it, expansion of a non-conforming structure or site element, or to argue that their rights have been terminated unjustly because of a decision of a city official, then they go to the ZBA. So there's a route for appeal, which is nice for them. All right, so that's nonconformities. The last few articles are just some administrative provisions about, the effective date of the ordinance and whose enforcement and responsibility for enforcement and that sort of thing. We have an appendix now that's got some figures in it that just illustrates some basic terminology and concepts, but also some more detailed provisions of language in the draft code. I wanted to talk to you about some things that we've changed since we saw you at the joint meeting. You may remember we kind of left care facilities up in the air because there's some pending litigation and staff hadn't had an opportunity. They wanted to give it some time, and they wanted to discuss internally some things they might want to do there. So we sort of went in and made some changes that may be just ones that get us by for a while, but there are provisions in there. The first things we wanted to do was to define the various uses, and I think there are 9 there. In where we could refer to a Texas Health and Safety Code definition, we did that and incorporated it into the definition that we came up with. So you can see there are several parentheses that reference that code. There's a Human Resources Code also that dictates community homes for persons with disabilities, where the city has probably the least ability to do regulation. They have a whole lot of flexibility, but you have to acknowledge that they do exist. And then there are several kinds of uses that are, I would say, Kerrville unique in terms of how they're defined and that sort of thing. So they all have a definition now. And then once you have the definition, so you define and then you assign to whatever zoning category seems appropriate. And if you look at that table, what you're seeing are the yellow columns. Those uses are allowed in the most restrictive districts, so those are the single-family type districts, and those are the uses, the ones with the Ps, where it was felt that those could work well enough in a single-family district. Okay, the ones in the green are in the least restrictive zoning districts. All right. Oh, is that right? No, the ones in the blue are in the least restrictive districts. So that's the multifamily and what downtown and mixed use and C3. And then the ones in green are in between. And the whole column is highlighted, but only where you have a P or a C is that use allowed. All right? So it's all based upon the intensity of the use and the character of the zoning district where it's been assigned. So that was the approach we took. And as we told the CRC when we met with them last, it would be nice if this could be even further simplified. But I think that that probably you as a community are not quite ready to do that yet. So maybe you put that on your list of things to sort of think about in the time ahead. Also wanted to point out to you the options that I talked about earlier with regard to smaller single-family lots. So we've added the option in the R2, which is the district that allows a whole variety of housing types, and in the RM district, which allows all of those types plus manufactured housing. So now there's the ability to do a 3,300 square foot lot with alleys. And the reason the alleys are going to be necessary is because of without them, there's going to be a real problem with on-street parking. On-street parking is going to block driveways.
I didn't see any definition of who maintains that alley. Does that become a city maintained alley?
It normally would, unless it's a development where all the internal streets and
with an HOA.
Alleys are HOA maintained. I mean, that's what normally happens. We also have the ability to do a 4,500 square foot lot without alleys. So in between 3,300 and 4,500, you'd need an alley. And again, it's all about on-street parking and providing for that without blocking streets and all that. And we were asked to do, as a team, an analysis of the impact of requiring an alley on a development. And the Kimley Horn folks came up with the fact that it costs about $1,800 additional per lot to provide an alley. But what happens is, you can net or yield an additional one lot, I think, for every 11 of the smaller lots you create. So, again, it's all about trade-offs. Also, while we're talking about that, I will mention to you that in the draft that you received, and you probably didn't even pick up on this, but there was a place in the table, I added an alley line to the bottom of the table, and that line should have reflected that access to alleys would be required for any lot that's less than 45 feet in width, not 50 feet, okay? So that should have been reflected in there, and it will definitely be reflected in the draft that goes to council.
And then the right of way, the alley right of way is 15 feet or
15.
It's 15. Okay, I think that email you sent to Chris said 20 with a 15-foot paved.
That's our
That what is
current
coded
standard,
right now? Okay.
City engineering's looking at that with
Okay.
their consultant as well, for the overall right-of-way standards. And some of that could depend on if it's public or private,
Sure.
and what flexibility we have there as well.
Okay, and then one other thing I wanted to point out to you, a couple of other things, I guess. We had some new regulations regarding accessory buildings, and I think we sort of talked. I don't remember if we talked at the joint meeting about this or not, but based on requests that staff has been receiving lately, it seemed to them a meritorious idea to create, instead of a setback based upon a size of the building, a standard setback for an accessory structure, and also because of the types of permit applications that are coming in. Your current ordinance has a maximum accessory building size of 528 square feet, and what they're seeing are people that are wanting to do 1,000, 1,200 square foot buildings because they want garage plus workshop or place to store their golf cart or whatever. So what we decided to do was to go with a 5-foot setback across the board for any building up to 1,000 square feet in size. Okay. Also, there was a question about allowing parking in areas that are designated as easements, which is not an uncommon thing at all to permit, with the understanding that if there's ever any need for the city or the utility company or whatever to get in and do construction within the easement in exchange for the ability to have parked on it, then the property owner has to do the repair to the parking surface. So that's in there now as well. And then I will point out to you, I know at the joint meeting we talked about the traffic impact analysis. Right now, it's not in the draft code, so that would show up in the checklist, in the application checklist. That we could put it in the draft code if you want to, and if you'll recall, what happens is with an application, a person would have to do a calculation of projected trips, net trips. So you take the, if you're taking a building down, you calculate trips for the new development, you subtract the trips that will be going away because the old development is there. And if that total exceeds 1,000 trips per day or 150 per, and it's new trips for the morning or the evening peak hour, then they have to do a more substantial traffic impact analysis. So those are the thresholds. Right now, that's not in the code. It would just be an item in the checklist, unless you would prefer to see it in the code. So you can give that some thought. I think it could be handled either way. All right. Last thing I wanted to do was just kind of wrap back around to the beginning and look at those goals and the approach and everything that we had outlined at the front, and show you what we've done to address those various issues. Create a user-friendly code. We talked about simplifying, streamlining, clarifying. We've reduced the number of zoning districts from 49 to 17. We've standardized the format for zoning district regulations to make it easier for users. In terms of revising out-of-date standards and uses, we have a whole bunch of new uses that are now in the land use table and new definitions to go with them. We reduced the number of CUPs. Setback and height regulations are now based upon the zoning district, not the use classification, which I think was a real issue before. We now have standards for parking and drive-through facilities that have been updated, and we've eliminated the special use district. In terms of addressing inconsistencies and minimizing the need for interpretations, that definition section hopefully will help with that. And where there were some requirements that were missing, we've sought to add them. Minimizing nonconformities was one of our goals. And for the residential, commercial, industrial, and airport districts, we maintained the area and height regulations as much as possible, or relaxed them a little bit in order not to create new nonconforming situations. We eliminated the side and rear yard setback requirements that were previously in those zoning districts, unless they're adjacent to single-family residential, because we do have this new goal of protecting your neighborhoods. And then finally for me, in order to support the Kerrville 2050 vision, we did create that new mixed-use category and revise the downtown standards to make it more supportive and to provide more emphasis on arts and culture. We added the residential options that I mentioned to you and modified existing regulations, hopefully to help you with your affordable housing situation. It's not going to solve the problem, but it's going to contribute to a solution. We added those distance and separation requirements for motor vehicle types of uses to protect limits like as a water source, which was the comp plan goal. And then we've got plans to develop overlay guidelines for downtown and the river corridor in the next phase of the project.
So I just have a couple of more slides for you. We want to talk about the draft zoning map that you also had in your packets. And really, rather than go through every detail of the map, we want to focus in on the approach we took to developing that map. Again, key focus on minimizing nonconformities and especially creating any new nonconformities based on this process. So what we did is we took your existing residential districts and we converted them to the proposed residential zoning district that was most in alignment with their current zoning. So in other words, we took what's out there today and we just tried to make an apples to apples transition to the new zoning district. For non-residential zoning districts, they were based on existing land use. So since there's more variation between the non-residential districts, we thought the most appropriate approach was to focus in on what's on the ground if we want to minimize nonconformities. So what that did is it reduced the amount of existing nonconformities, and I can tell you that the new nonconformities that arose through this process were primarily parcels inside the future investment areas identified in the Kerrville 2050 Comprehensive Plan. So if you recall, one of the overriding goals was let's get zoning in place that enables people to come in under the new zoning and develop in alignment with that future vision. And that future vision in most cases was expanding opportunities for what people could do with their properties for economic gain. So we have your, I'm doing the same thing, Monica. We have your existing zoning map in there, and, well, I'm sorry, I skipped right through it. So your current zoning map, again, we pointed this out a couple of times, but 49 districts on your existing map, broken out geographically. The colors were not in alignment with essentially what land uses were allowed there. And your new map has been revised to where it's now 17 districts. The colors, the yellow colors, are what you would expect to see for residential uses. Red, pink colors are what you would typically see for commercial types of uses. So just intuitively, folks in the industry can look at your map and say, that's a place I can locate my business in the future. So just as a recap related to the nonconformities. So the proposed future zoning, essentially what we did is an analysis of the uses on properties to see what was either definitely not permitted or likely not permitted in the future moving forward due to the new zoning. And there were 40 of those uses, or 40 of those parcels that were either not permitted or likely not permitted with the zoning that was in place. So 34 of those, or 85%, were within the strategic catalyst areas. So again, if you think back to Kerrville 2050, we had strategic catalyst areas. Within those, a lot of those areas were envisioned in the future to transform into a mixed-use type of zoning or other types of uses. 85% of them are due to us trying to align this to create more opportunities moving forward based on Kerrville 2050. 15% of those, or 6 of them, were outside the strategic catalyst areas. In comparison to that overall of 40 on the new zoning, on your existing zoning, in the analysis we did of the existing zoning on parcels, there were 157 properties that had either not permitted or likely not permitted. So we did achieve that goal of reducing nonconformities, and the majority of those are based on the future vision of seeing something new and better happening in the future. So that is the bulk of our presentation. I understand it was a long presentation on a streamlined code, but just only imagine if we were trying to present your existing code to you, how long that presentation would take. So we appreciate your time and can answer any questions.
All right, Mark and Monica, thank you for the time that y'all have spent on this, and thank you for the summary explanations and putting it in lay terms that we can understand. We appreciate it. Before I open this up for discussion, this is a call for public hearing, and I'm going to open that public hearing at this time. 5:41. Anybody wishing to make comments in this regard, step to the podium. Give us your name and address, please. I did not have any speaker requests, so anybody wishing to just go to the podium. Bruce?
Bruce Streaky, 615 Earl Garrett. In general, I'm really happy. I'm concerned about a couple things, and I'm going to start with the last one. He talks about the changes in the non-conforming uses. Specifically, I'd like to bring your attention to the area on Memorial Boulevard between Schreiner University and Loop 534. It's currently a commercial zone, and if we could we pull that map up, or is there any way to do that? Thank you. Commercially, that's a commercial zone, and in the past, we had a hard time bringing new business to that part of town because of our screening requirement that 2-3 years ago required, I believe it was a 50-foot buffer along with the fence. And we got that changed to be an 8-foot fence if there was a residential use, even though that residential use was non-conforming for the zone, but it was an existing use, and we wanted to put in a new business next door. We had to have a 50-foot buffer, and we got that changed about 2 years ago to be an 8-foot privacy fence. Okay, but now we're going back because we're going to create that residential buffer at 25 feet, which we can use for parking and such. But because there are so many residential uses on Memorial Boulevard, if you look at that map, if you zoom into that spot, it becomes almost a residential zone. Look at all these R1. These are all now R1 again. They're no longer commercial. And so this will limit us to being able to bring new business to that part of town. And that may be what we want. But I don't think that's not what I anticipated. And I don't think the property owners anticipated that for some people out there. So I just want to bring that to your attention. I don't have a specific complaint from a client or a property owner. I'm just looking at that map saying I don't think that's the intended result we were after for that particular area.
What are your thoughts to address that?
What's that?
What are your thoughts to address that?
Well, I don't understand why we're not using mixed use or R2 or C2 or C1 in that area. So I don't understand why we're taking it from a commercial zone that was in a transition toward more commercial, and now it seems like we're taking a step back to leave it residential. You know, it's the old state highway. I get it. 50 years ago, along the way into town, But is that the direction we're trying to go today? And I don't know the answer, guys. Public hearing is the first time we've gotten to talk about it.
There's some other areas I had the same concern.
I agree.
I think it's trying to not have non-conforming uses. Those are, and I have the same concern, so.
I understand that philosophy of not having non-conforming uses, but we also need to talk about where do we want the city to go?
I agree, and it's not
So,
just this area, there's several of those
again,
areas.
I don't have a specific complaint. I don't have a client complaining.
Do
I don't
you?
own a piece of property there.
Do you feel that should be more of a commercial then all the way down from Shriner
I
to
do.
534?
I do. I mean, when I get calls about property for that area, it's never about I want to have a house, but I'm not a house guy, so maybe there's.
Well,
you
from
know,
Shriner into town, it is commercial, and it would make more sense for it to be in this area. I agree with that.
So, for example, there's a property on the corner, just past Loop 534, that's currently zoned commercial. They got a CUP to bring in a mobile home. The CUP, by the way, isn't being enforced. And now this is gonna become R1? You know, again, that kind of stuff just doesn't make sense. So, that's a concern to me. But I get why we got there, and I didn't understand until he just explained it. We're trying to get rid of non-conforming uses. I just not sure that's the right direction. And you're right, Rustin, I picked that spot because it was a big spot. There are some other spots that I have some concerns like that as well. I think there's some on Jefferson and a couple in the downtown area. So, and again, this is a big project. I'm not on the committee. I haven't had the time. You all have had to study it. I'm just real quickly trying to bring up a few things that I saw.
Do you have a marker, or you can point that out on the map?
I can send a list to Drew.
I mean, right now, can we
What?
look at it?
Say, tell me, what am I?
Can we look at this on the screen?
Which?
The
okay.
specific area you're talking about.
That was what they
Pull that spot back up again.
Yeah, I'm zooming in on this spot. Here's the loop. Here's Memorial. There, this is Shriner University. And I'm talking about basically from where Wayland Plumbing used to be, all the way down to the back 40. And you see all these light yellows? Those are now gonna be R1.
Looking at what's being used right now instead of being
Right.
more forward-looking.
You got it? You know what
Follow that.
No, I drive that about every day. I agree.
And there
I
are a lot of residential uses currently there, but is that what we want
I
to
don't
encourage
think that's
in
gonna
the
be
future?
the future use.
And then if I want to bring a business in now, I've got to go 25 feet on either side, and some of those lots are only 75 feet wide. So that happened to us on a particular property. I can point out some years in the past that I no longer have listed, where we tried to bring businesses. Dan Kirkendall tried to bring a business there. Some other folks tried to bring a business there, and the screening requirement wouldn't have let us fit it. We had to push everything back so far.
Drew, isn't that really now an RT?
No, it's
I believe it's E31.
yeah, something like that.
I think, off the top of my head. Which that current zoning district is a very eclectic district. It does allow for single family and several of the commercial uses. Again, the code review committee gave our consultants the direction to look at non-conforming properties as their focus. So some of these areas did get quite a few varying zoning districts applied to these areas. We have not gone back to look at that as far as long-term, what's the focus on that? Because again, coming from the code review committee, their primary focus was the non-conformities.
Well, and how do you really, I mean, what would you zone it? I mean, obviously it's being occupied as a single-family residence. I mean, what do you zone it as to accommodate a potential future
I
use?
haven't studied the land use table as much as I wish I had, but my gut right now says it would be mixed use or a C2.
And either way, some of those properties would become non-conforming through that process. One of the things staff is going to do is, following the adoption of the code and the map, is come back in 6 months with either some special areas like this that we need to dive in a little deeper and do a small area plan to revise that. get some input from the community in that immediate area. Or if it's a code section that needs tweaking, modifying, something that's not working or is working well.
Mark, let me ask you, how does the 2050 plan look at that property? I don't think it looks at it as future residential.
I believe it's outside of the catalyst areas.
Yeah, it was outside of a catalyst area. So off the top of my head, I can't tell you exactly those specific properties, how the 2050 plan looked at them. But we do recognize, and there was some discussion with the committee, that was an eclectic area that was transitioning. And there were, in the future, there's potential, there could be some residential mixed in with some businesses and just all kinds of things happening in that area, which you do want to encourage in your community in some areas, that that type of eclectic conglomeration of uses. But based upon the fact that we were trying to look at nonconformities, number one, that was the direction that we went with the committee, was going back and looking at the existing use. We did, Drew touched on something. We have found throughout the years, as much as we want to be perfect, there is no code that is perfect day one. And we encourage staff to start making a list of things that need to be tweaked and then bring those things back to P&Z and council in a 3-month, 6-month period and say, hey, these are things that were the unanticipated consequences of what we did, and we need to get these things fixed, because that wasn't our intent on what we did. But in this case, we looked at the existing uses to move forward.
Well, I would agree with Bruce that that kind of zoning would probably impede any new commercial business. There's going to be some that go in, they may buy an old house there, convert it to a business. I just don't see future residential development. Maybe down the road, I don't see multifamily down there. I see it more commercial. Yeah, so I don't want us to get to a point that it's a big challenge to modify that.
Well, I don't think we want to find ourselves in a situation where we're having to, play, should this be residential, or are we going to ruin this guy's property value because this guy wants to put in, whatever else? What did we do before? I didn't ever get really wound up in the other code, because thank heavens this was coming. And we call it residential to commercial. We spoke about that as a...
That's what
That's
RT was.
okay, all right.
That's what that currently is.
Right, okay. Well, I think we need to be very, very careful, and your point's well made, Bruce, but we gotta be very careful about how this gets handled in terms of dictating what, Mark's gonna be done.
So, Mr. Chairman and Commission, I think the complexity of this one is that the old zoning included you could do residential and you could
Right.
do commercial. It wasn't RT, but it was that, geographic zoning. So that's what made it difficult in terms of saying, well, what is this? So I think in terms of all the new options that you would have with the new zoning code, probably the best fit would be mixed use. Because then you have the flexibility and you also take care of the non-conforming. So you can still do commercial, but you're okay if you're residential. Because mixed use allows both.
Well, you're still gonna have the same problem as we had out here on, up on 16, if one guy looked at it, it's gonna be commercial, and the residents who had been there for 50 years looked at it, by golly, gonna be residential, so.
Well,
Right, but the difference here is that it already allows for both residential
Okay.
and commercial.
All
So
But does it-
mixed use would not be a change.
But does that really help you, Bruce? I mean, if you buy, if it's the same situation where this guy decides that he wants to sell his house and somebody levels it, you still have those building restrictions and setbacks because it's still abutting another residence.
And you know what, it goes back to that, that exhibit that I haven't studied enough about the heights. And remind me that the height, that limit, that 25-foot setback only starts when the height gets to a certain height, and that was
25-foot setback is
always.
Regardless.
Yeah. Okay, so
So it doesn't really solve that
So that does
issue.
create another issue. Now, the old ordinance was 50 feet, and so you could come 50 feet on 100 on both sides, and you end up losing 100 feet. So that's half that size. I haven't studied this enough to say if that's the right number, or, should it be 20 feet or 12, or I'm not ready to answer that question, Tricia, but it is an issue that does come up. It would be better than the previous screening ordinance we had, and I understand the logic of it, but that wouldn't apply in a mixed-use development, because that's when the zone,
Okay.
that solves the problem if we go mixed use, because now I'm consistent zone, I don't have that screening requirement. I would on the back, which is residential, and that's okay, that doesn't concern me.
You're talking
But
about
the
sides.
consistency along the state highway. And David, to address your point, I agree 100%, and I'm not criticizing at all what these folks did or the direction they were given, I'm just saying something that I'm commenting about.
Right, so, yeah.
But one of the things that I think that does make this place different is that it's on a state highway. Right? If we were going through, like, there is a spot, I think on Jefferson, where all of a sudden there's an R1, and I think that's odd. But it does get down now that I'm picking, right? I'm picking whether it's gonna be this way or that way. On a state highway, do we really want R1 on a state highway? Inside the city limits? And so I think that's a reasonable argument to talk about and decide maybe that's the way we draw that
Well, I
line.
think the reality is that when that property goes up for resale, it's not gonna be bought as someone wanting to live on that highway.
Well, the one example I pointed out with the CUP did sell
Yeah.
for them to add,
Did they?
it was sold for that particular purpose, which really surprised me, and it was a listing we had. We represented the seller, and the folks who showed up and pulled out their wallet wanted to
The mobile home on it.
put a mobile home on it. So while I want to agree with you, I can point out that it's not always true. So, and that is a big part of the challenge of what we're doing here. So-
Wasn't that an exception because the other house that was there was a relative?
Yeah,
Okay,
and
so
I
that-
didn't mean to pick on those
Yeah,
folks.
yeah, but
Bill,
that
it's
that
just
makes
an
an
example.
understandable exception there.
Yeah.
But Mark, what you're saying, your direction was to reduce non-conforming.
That's correct.
Okay, and if we didn't look at that direction on this property laying here, then could be mixed use. And the non-conforming should go away at some point. Yeah,
Just wanted, you had a question earlier, Commissioners, regarding what the future land use plan is indicated within Kerrville 2050. I don't have it up on the map, but I certainly can show you individually. This is Strategic Catalyst Area 9, which was located roughly around Schreiner University. There is an area between there and Loop 534, a small area of community commercial around the intersection of 534 and 27, as well as up closer to Schreiner University. The area in between was generally considered transitional residential.
but if you do RT in there, a commercial business has to build a house under 3,000 feet, and it has to look like a house.
And it's not RT, it's transitional residential.
Transitional
which has a
residential.
different definition under the future land use plan. It's more akin to multifamily and a higher density, I believe, townhomes and that. So not necessarily residential.
Not the RT.
That's
Okay.
correct, not the RT zone. It's transitional residential, which is used in the future land use plan. So I just wanted to clarify that.
So
with you.
what you're saying, that the plan thinks it's gonna be more multifamily than it would be
That's
commercial.
what was included within the future land use plan. Certainly, these plans evolve, but that's what was indicated within the Kerrville 2050 future land use.
But it proves if you had a client that wanted to put a business in that area, he's gonna be responsible for the new 25-foot setbacks on each side.
Right, and if he buys one of the properties that are proposed to be R1 now, he'd have to come and get the zoning changed as well, so. And I was not aware that the future land use plan was showing that to be transition residential with a higher multifamily, and I don't, maybe, somebody smarter than me thinks that's the direction it'll go, and it's okay with me.
So what happens, we get back to spot
Feeling like I've
zoning.
gotten into a fight.
We get back to spot zoning.
No, I don't want to do that. I think that's a mistake. I think the use of I mean, there really is a place for the PD, and I'm going to be before you bring in a big one, hundreds of acres, soon, and that's a really valuable tool. But these small PDs have always confused me, and I've used them. It's a tool I've used, but I've always really felt that wasn't a good tool for us as a city. So I'm not excited about that. I would rather see something more like mixed use, but if the future land use plan says it's transition residential, maybe that's a good thing for Kerrville.
I think there's a handful of these little areas that I think need more attention, and you can see them when there's 5 different zones in one small block. Something strange is going on there, and that's what jumped out at me in my review of the map. And this was one of the areas that you can see it. There's just a lot of things happening, and to me that's not in keeping with trying to simplify things. That's complicated things a little bit.
And I don't want to derail stuff. I love where we're headed, and if this is one of those things that needs to be tweaked a little later and talked about, I'm just trying to point out something I noticed. I love where we're headed with this thing. Can I talk about a few specific examples, though, where I do have clients or properties that we own that we have some concerns about?
Sure.
OLH Block 1, Lots 1 and 2 recently got changed to the AD zone, but it's shown as a PD on the map. Same thing with OLH Block 2, Lot 3, and a meets and bounds portion of Lot 2 is now AD, but it's shown as PD. The lots we were talking about with the mobile home on it, the Sutton Addition block, lots 3A and 3B are going to be R1, but they're currently E29, and I just think that's interesting. We talked about the Memorial Boulevard R1. Clearwater Paseo, we have a client with 2 properties there. One's next door to Atmos and then next door to the county's jail, and it's being proposed to be R2, which struck me as odd, at the corner of Clearwater Paseo and East Main. And then the same owner happens to own another property that's at the corner of Clearwater Paseo and Rio Monte, across from K-Pub and next to the PDs that McDonald's companies did with apartments, and it's proposed to be zone C2. And I kind of thought, I've always thought back to the opposite of those 2 lots as I've been marketing them over the years. And I don't, again, know the right answer. It just, that one jumped out at me. Because R2 I don't really see next to the razor wire with the jail and the Atmos building. And then the other one I get is closer to the commercial district that's along Memorial, but it's on the north side of Rio Monte, and it's right next to apartments and then housing to the east. So I kind of thought those should be flipped. And do I need to send you a letter, Drew, of specific, or is it enough to have it here on the list? What do I do? That's what I want to ask. Who?
Yes.
Send a letter. Okay, I'll do it. Francisco Lemus. At the end of Francisco Lemus, right next to the river, we have an RT zone that all of a sudden goes to R1. And I think that building on the end there is currently being used as a short-term rental. It's already a commercial business. And so I thought that was odd. And then there's another Francisco Lemus property that's up closer to Main Street, I want to say, that was R1 that surprised. That whole district is more commercial and transitional to me, and I thought that was odd that we jumped to R1. I noticed I thought I had some property in a PD and it's in R1, and so I need to come back and talk to you. There's right over by where LaForest currently is on Junction Highway, there's 3 properties. One has a Junction Highway address, 2 have Arcadia Loop access addresses, but don't touch Arcadia Loop. But they're the only R1 in that whole area, and it just struck me again as funny as being on the state highway and being R1, 1803 Junction Highway. And then Camp Meeting Road, there's 208 acres owned by LDB Corp on Camp Meeting Road that currently has about 28 or 30 of it on the front side between Camp Meeting and Medina Highway that's zoned commercially, and then the back balance, 170 acres or so, is zoned residentially. And it surprised me that everything was going to R1. I have really been trying to sell people on putting on that front piece, putting apartments there next to the highway. And so I was really thinking that was gonna be R2 or R3. And then the back would be more estate lots or single family. And so it would be an R1 or an RE in the new zone. And so that was just, and that's an important piece for us because there's already utilities on it from a residential standpoint. In fact, I showed it to the Housing Task Force guys today. So that was it. Those are my comments. And you want a list? Okay. Thank you all very much. I love where we're going. I love all the work everybody's done. I want to thank everybody. I wish I knew you all. Thanks. Thank you, guys.
Bruce. Drew, do you have any comments on?
I forgot one. I apologize. I'm so sorry. There are 5 properties at the corner of Clay Street and Barnett that are currently C19, I think. They're commercially zoned. And there's an RT district that comes down Clay Street, and it would make so much more sense if those 5 lots right there on the south corner, the south corner, right there next to the CBD. So it's surrounded by CBD, and I was surprised the RT district didn't just come in right there. I was surprised the RT district didn't continue just across Barnett there because it's commercial on the other side, and it just made sense to kind of keep that as a residential transition commercial zone surrounded by CBD and the commercial on the other side. And that was one that really surprised me.
So, just a quick comment about that. So what we struggled with a lot is this whole idea of not using this process to arbitrarily rezone property. So if it was try to eliminate the nonconformities, but we didn't, even if we thought it made sense with Kerrville 2050, we didn't want to go and just arbitrarily make a piece of property, R1 when it was already commercial, or vice versa, or PD when it wasn't PD. Even if it made sense in like the example he gave with the Clay Street Barnett, because you have people that live around that property that already have a vested interest around it, and they need to go through a rezoning process, right? So we were really careful not to use this process to basically rezone property, but to try to make it as consistent as possible with what it is today, understanding that our districts didn't match up completely, except for on the residential side. So that was a tricky part of this, and there's some that are just a little gray. I think you heard some of those from Bruce just now. And one of the things that we are going to be doing as staff, recommending to the council is, for the next 6 months, if we hear from somebody that they found out that, there was a mix-up on these 17,000 parcels in terms of what it should be, they're going to take it through a zoning process at no charge. They just have to go through a process, though, because once it's in place, it's in place. So it's really hard to get it perfect, but we also want to make sure that we weren't arbitrarily rezoning through this process of adopting a new zoning code.
So what you're saying, Mark, is we can proceed, take note of these specific properties that Bruce outlined, maybe others, Rustin had some, that we can address before it goes to council, or that we take up as the need arises.
I think each parcel is going to be unique, and we need to look at each of them and see what makes the most sense. And then ultimately, you all decide when you refer it back to the council can adopt something. So it's probably going to be a little bit of both.
But that's not, is that something we need to address now or give instructions on? We'll just take them as they come.
Well, just some direction from you on how you would like us to handle those.
Okay.
I'd like to hire some consultants. Tell us what.
All right. Anybody else wishing to speak during this public hearing? Seeing none, hearing none, I close a public hearing at 6:09. Commissioners, comments?
I had the same concerns that Bruce brought up. That was one, and also to say that I really liked the code. Of course, everything else was good. Mainly, it was just the map was where my concerns lie. Everything else looked good. The other question on the map was we turned a lot of properties into PIs, public and institutional, some small churches, some small nonprofits, and I don't understand why we did that on those parcels. Maybe you guys can help me with that. It seems to create a few problems down the road in my mind.
Again, we created the PI district to accommodate exactly those types of uses. So it was looking at what's on the ground and trying to create districts that were catering to what was on the ground. So what are some of the issues?
Well, I mean, these are just individual, a lot of them are just individual lots, and now they're zoned. Maybe in my mind, it's your approach, you know, that church or nonprofit decides to sell. I mean, the uses are very limited, obviously. The setbacks can be different. And so I don't see, I mean, I can see it for Shriner University, of course, but for a very small church or something, I'm not understanding why that wouldn't, because it would not be a non-conforming use, say it was a residential area. There was no, I don't see a reason to rezone it.
So I guess if that church were to sell that that is proposed to be a public institutional use, if it were to sell and somebody wanted to do something different in the area, it would just be going through a process to be able to make that occur.
Right. What's the advantage to doing it, I guess? Because they weren't non-conforming before.
Okay. So you're saying they weren't non-conforming because of their use was allowed within a residential district?
Right.
Okay. So
if we left it residential, that's what I'm not understanding why that change was necessary. It seems like it could create some problems, and it wasn't a helpful change.
Okay.
So that was just my question.
Well, the purpose again was to put those, to create some criteria for those types of uses and buildings to be able to fit within, so that was the reason behind it.
I don't think nonprofits get the same exemption that churches do. They're usually commercial buildings.
Well, take for instance on Clay Street and Barnett, Cam. Now that lot has been changed to a public and institutional.
Yeah, no, I would agree in that case. That's easily converted to another kind of business.
Good.
Yeah.
Used to be an auto parts store.
Well, I think there's probably several churches in town that are occupying commercial style buildings that don't necessarily, that could be multi-use. That's what you're getting at, right?
Yeah,
they could be repurposed tomorrow with very little change.
Right. Churches do come and go, nonprofits come and go. And
I see your point.
And automobile parts places.
So basically, churches are in places that are already conforming, so they don't need to go back and change into PI.
Right, I don't understand the need for the change.
Nonprofits, CAM is a great example. I don't see why it should be a PI as well, because it could be a multi-use. But is it conforming now?
That I don't know if they're conforming.
Well, it must. I mean, it must be. I'm not sure what that particular corner is zoned. Commercial, I would think.
C19, I believe that.
Is it? Okay.
Not a huge deal breaker or anything. Just I didn't understand why we were doing it, and it seemed like it could create some problems, and I didn't understand the advantage.
Those are things we could give instructions to staff to look at. Russ, anything else?
No, those are my two things. Thank you.
All right, Garrett?
I think, all of these points have been brought up are things that definitely need to be addressed before approval is recommended to council. I don't think it should, and I don't think everything can be answered at the same time. But I think some of these things we're starting to see enough that it needs to be at least a plan to address some of these things that need to be changed or could be changed. I had just a small, hopefully easy fix, is that in the table of contents, I don't see listed specifically zoning map or land use table. Whenever I have clients coming to me whether they're developers or whether they are individuals wanting to do a project, and can I do this project here? Those are the first two things that I look at immediately as a land use table and zoning map. I think it should be, those things should be called out specifically. I don't know where it would fall in the table of contents, but something that's easy to find.
As an appendix, maybe.
Well, if
It's in the
appendix is listed, but I say,
Be a little more specific.
yeah, if that's the case, then list those things
Where they get to it easier, I
where
agree.
where somebody can find it easily.
I agree. Drew, that's pretty easy fix, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Tricia?
I'd like to have a more defined process for these issues that everybody's talking about right now. Like, how are we going to handle these? Not just, oh, they go through the process. I feel like if we need a little more detailed process for those folks that feel like they don't want that zone that's been set forth, or like Bruce has properties that are for sale that possibly need to be changed. So I think there should be a defined process for that.
In general, there's two ways we can do it. The property owner could apply for his own case and just go through the normal process. If it's not something that's time pressing, if it's a specific area, like I said, we can do more of a public study with that area and look at what they think the future land use plan, future zoning should be, and come back with a larger recommendation for one whole area. Memorial Boulevard being one of those examples. Get the involvement of the community there before we make those drastic changes.
David?
Well, I like to say I can deal with yes, I can deal with no, it's the maybes that kill you, you know? And so that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at process is a good word. We don't need to make work. We have enough work. We have enough real hard questions with people with real life changing decisions facing them that come before us. And we have to make recommendations, and we put it up on council, and council has to make their judgments. And so specifically, and again, your overall charge was to, you know, get us out of this bind and whatever. But I think that we need to set a Memorial is a great example. There, without question, we need to do something about that strip. And yes, it's a state highway. At one point in time, it was the highway from New Orleans to Los Angeles, for crying out loud. It was the road. And so we need to make sets of these various things. If we get down to 1 and 2 lots, then some of that stuff's just going to have to shake out. But we have to have here's the step by step. And to hear us say that somebody comes up and well, my lot got put in the wrong boat, you know, what are you going to do about it? Well, you're going to apply for rezoning. Well, I'm sorry, it's already been zoned, you know. And again, as Bruce said a couple of times, what we've done and moved forward with this stuff is great. And these are all familiar things that anybody that's worked in the industry throughout the country has seen before. It's very comforting. But, you know, we've got to overlay that on what we have in Kerrville. And I think it can be done. But again, let's make sure we got our rules right. The rules are right before people come to us, and we're then have direction as to how we're supposed to respond. Please.
Drew, do you have any recommendations?
No, I've had conversations with several of you, several citizens, similar concerns as far as the map. Again, we're not looking at this process for the new zoning code and the new zoning map to rezone properties. That's a separate discussion. But did we hit the mark? Are we close? Again, the code review committee direction was nonconformities first, which does put us in this situation for these particular areas. The planning commission naturally looking at kind of a bigger picture, looking at the future land use plan and what does that zoning recommend. We've got to find that balance in between. But again, with the specific areas, not having those property owner input, making those changes, I think the code review committee had a good start. Let's look at the nonconformities so that we're not pulling the rug out from under anybody for what they have today. everyone has the option of changing what they have in the future through that process. So,
So do you have a recommendation as to how we might proceed
I think a big
from
part of
this
it,
point?
big part of it would be
Without going
to,
back and taking each one of these individual things and treating and curing them
Right.
before we approve this process.
I think if we try to go through and pinpoint each inconsistency that we have, we may be here for a long time. Of course, at the same time, we know we're applying new zoning to property owners that may not have had specific input. But I think adopting it as is or with some minor adjustments from the direction of the planning commission, and then staff again come back in either 3 to 6 month time frame with some of those small areas as an update.
So we could approve this and then do that work, come back and amend this at that point.
That's correct.
You could, my recommendation would be that you don't do it tonight, that you come back on July 18th. And at that point, we'll have looked at these properties, and we may have some solutions. And also outline some processes for you all that would be, you know, to go forward, so.
Well, it's,
That makes sense.
I'm with Garrett 100%. Everybody asks, so what's the zoning here? Well, look at the map. Look at the map. You know, it's color coded. Give me an example. Everybody wants some visual. So, you know, let's color it orange. That's an ugly color. And that's the areas that have to be looked at, you know. That's Memorial. That's over on Clay Street, up whatever. And everything else is pretty straightforward. You've done a great job of putting everything in categories. And so we need the map. And we have another meeting before, maybe that could be a first step. And then get rid of the hard stuff, and then, get rid of the easy stuff, and then have the hard stuff be what we're gonna,
So we have another P and Z meeting set for July 18th. Between now and then, we could direct the staff to go back and look at these situations that were noted. You can get the details from Bruce as to what those specific areas are. Rustin had some. I like what he brought up about the PI designations on, especially nonprofits, maybe small churches. Right now, we have a building right across from the police department that went through that process.
Right.
It was a church, and now it's offices. And so, is that clear enough direction for y'all to work with to come back on the
Yes, it is.
18th? Anything y'all would like to add?
I think that's good.
Okay. Any other business in this regard? Okay, if not, let me see. Yeah. If not, we're adjourned.